In an article on the American Atheists website, you can find the following claim, and I want to quote this directly. Quote, "We have examined all the biblical evidences alleged to prove the existence of Jesus as an historical figure. We have found they have no legitimacy as evidence." They continue. "All evidence," they say, "alleged to support such a claim is without substance," end quote. So essentially, they're saying that there's no legitimate evidence in the Bible or outside of the Bible for the existence of Jesus. So was Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth, a real person? Apparently, it's a question a lot of people have asked. In fact, if you type in "was Jesus" in Google, last time I checked anyway, it was the number one question, the number one Google search suggestion. Was Jesus a real person? Was Jesus a historical figure? Was he a real man that walked around in Roman Palestine, Roman Judea, all these years ago, centuries ago? And so it's an interesting question. Apparently, a lot of people want to know about it. And so I'd like to discuss that today. First, I want to take a look at the biblical evidence for Jesus as a real person. You might say, well, hey, that's not fair. Those are biased sources. But we have to look at those sources from a historical perspective and even a critical perspective, the same way that we would treat other written sources from the same time. We need to examine the scripture, examine the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, on their own evidence, on their own merits. And so we see that even though in the four gospels we have similar accounts, some of the material overlaps, particularly in what is known, what are known as the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A lot of that material, you find different iterations of it. Maybe it's rearranged in different ways. But the point is, you're seeing a lot of consensus, and not necessarily a lot of strong evidence that there was some sort of, united source that was the beginning source from which these later accounts were derived. So you see similar accounts, but they differ enough that they dispel any idea that there was some type of a top-down structured collusion in the composition of those texts. It dispels the idea that there is any type of conspiracy between the writers. You just don't see that. There's different angles, different perspectives. Even from the author's point of view, they have what would be called an authorial agenda. They're trying to make a certain point. For example, Matthew highlights how Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled prophecy, fulfilled the expectations of the Jewish people from their own scriptures. He highlights a lot of that Jewish element of Jesus' life and ministry, whereas Luke tends to speak in more universal terms, and his audience seemingly was a generalized Greco-Roman first century Mediterranean audience. And so we see these differences that dispel any idea that there was collusion, differences in style. But we also look at evidence from, example, the book of Acts and the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, later known as St. Paul the Apostle. Such an opponent of the message of Jesus, fighting against the early Christians, persecuting them, dragging them off to prison. Even Luke records that he was a participant there, observationally at least, watching the killing of St. Stephen, the first martyr. And yet we see how Saul of Tarsus, so opposed to the message of Jesus Christ, so opposed to the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus proclaimed, and yet, according to Luke's recording, Jesus appears to Saul, and it completely turns him around. And from being the greatest opponent, the greatest adversary, antagonist of the Christian movement, and he turns 180 degrees and becomes one who actually is the greatest proponent, the greatest protagonist, the greatest missionary, the greatest evangelist of this burgeoning movement. And so I think that that's interesting, and even just a side note here, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, really were one volume essentially, a continuation, a sequel, if you will, by Luke, the physician. And even critics of the New Testament recognize that Luke's historicity, his skill as a historian, is beyond reproach. Things that he claimed and documented, archaeology and other historical work has shown that those things were factual. They were very well recorded, documented with great specificity, even the use of his terms, very specific terms for Roman authorities, different types of authorities and ranks and what have you. And so, as a historian, you can set aside the religious claims of Luke if you just consider him as a historian. He is an excellent historian by any standard. And so, what evidence we see in the Bible, I've already talked about a little bit, but what about evidence outside of the Bible? Well, I'd like to look first. We've got a couple of sources I'd like to mention that are not biblical, but they are Christian. They're Christian in nature. They didn't make it into the canon, but they're very old, right in the same relative time frame that the books of the New Testament were written in. The first one is called the Didache. That simply means the teaching, and it was written conservatively. Dr. Michael Holmes estimates it was written somewhere from the 60s of the first century, maybe a little bit closer to the end of the first century, but, estimating it somewhere around as early as 60 AD, but maybe all the way up to 80, 90 AD. But still very, very early, within the first century, this book was composed. Dr. Michael Spiegel, with whom I studied, actually, a wonderful teacher, great guy, funny guy. Check him out. He's got some great resources that I think you'd find very interesting. He's got some popular level stuff if you maybe don't feel like you're a natural academic or haven't had formal training in some of these questions of Christian theology and Christian history. He's got some popular level books out there that you can find that I would recommend just to explore and kind of dip your toes in the water, so to speak. But Dr. Spiegel estimates that the Didache was probably written even as early as 50 AD, maybe up to 70 AD. And so regardless of which time frame you accept, and we're talking about a very, very early document, well seated within the second half of the first century. And so you're talking about a document that attests to the fact that Jesus was a real person. I mean, that's given. That's understood. The whole document is permeated with the theology and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who the writer and his audience accepted as the Christ, the Messiah. And so very good evidence, very strong outside of the Bible. I'd also like to mention Clement of Rome, his first letter to the Corinthians. Now, don't get these Corinthian letters confused with St. Paul's letters that are in the New Testament. St. Clement also wrote letters to the Corinthian church, and I guess they had a lot of problems over there. He was dealing with it, putting out some fires, just like Paul the Apostle was a little bit earlier. But at any rate, Clement of Rome's letter, the first letter to the Corinthians, again, conservatively speaking, and these are not just Christian scholars that would attest to this. Any scholars, for the most part, the consensus is that these books, this book, particularly Clement of Rome, First Corinthians, was probably written around 80, probably before 97 AD. So very, very early. And we have this extra biblical attestation that, yes, Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, was in fact not only accepted by these authors as a real human being, but he was also accepted even by that early date as God, as divine, with a message for all humanity. So that's a pretty amazing thing. So we've talked about the biblical, the New Testament, witness to the reality of Jesus as a human being, as a historical figure. Talked about extra biblical Christian writings. So, what about extra biblical non Christian writings? Well, we've got a few that have survived. And what's amazing about this? Now, I'm going to give you three examples. We'll look at these in a second. But before I do, I want you to think about it because some people say, well, if Jesus was so important and he had so many followers and he was doing all these miracles, and if he really rose from the dead, then, why do we only have three historical sources? Actually, there's some others that I didn't include, but just taking, for example, these three, someone would say, why don't we have more than three? Why is he not all over the place? Well, you got to remember, okay, from the standpoint of the Roman government, Jesus of Nazareth was a very minor figure. The other thing to think about is that at that early stage in the Christian movement, there was such a blending in the minds of those outside, at least, between the Jewish community, the Jewish synagogue, and this burgeoning movement that was really viewed from the outside, at least, as a movement within Judaism. And so it was just another iteration, another flavor, if you will, of Judaism. And, the Romans were used to religious plurality. There were so many gods. Jesus was not the only rabbi, for sure. He wasn't even the only teacher. He probably wasn't even the only person in that era that had some claim of divinity. I mean, it was not uncommon in the Roman culture to attribute divine characteristics or divine origin to heroes, military conquerors, etc. And so it's not really that surprising when you think of it from that standpoint that Jesus of Nazareth was somewhat off the radar. And yet, we do have very solid literary evidence for Jesus as a human being, Jesus as an actual historical figure. So let's take a look at this. The first one I want to mention to you is Tacitus. Now, Tacitus is one of the most respected, most trusted ancient historians. He was born about 56 AD, lived to about 120 AD. And so within living memory of the Christ event where people that would have met Jesus would have still been alive at the time that Tacitus lived. He was a senator under Vespasian, proconsul. So he's very tight with the Roman power structure of the time. And he wrote some writings called the Annals. And in one of them, it's actually number 15. If you want to look up, it's Annals 1544. And he's talking about Emperor Nero and some of the drama that was going on with Nero and how he was trying to pin the blame for the Roman fires on this new group called Christians. Let me read what Tacitus writes. I quote, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, talking about crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. End quote. So Tacitus is mixing in a little bit of sarcasm, but there's no question that he recognizes that there is this religious figure from Judea, Christus, that died by the extreme penalty, as he calls it, crucifixion. He mentions the reign of Tiberius, the procuratorship of Pontius Pilate, and so we have these time stamps that line up with the scriptures, and he's aware of the populace that has recognized these Christians as followers of Christus. And so there's no question who we're talking about here, that Tacitus is mentioning the man we know as Jesus Christ of Nazareth. There's no question about it. How about Pliny the Younger? Now, some people say Pliny, some say Pliny. I kinda like Pliny. I like that kinda roll off the tongue sound that it has. It sounds better than Pliny. Pliny. Pliny the Younger, AD 61 to 113 approximately. He was a governor of the Roman province of Bithynia, and he was that governor from 111 until his death in 113. So we know exactly when he would have written this letter. So just after the turn of the first century into the second century, and he wrote this to the Emperor Trajan. And this is in Pliny's letters. This is letter 1096 through 97. You can find this at pretty much anywhere. You could Google this. You could find this readily. But let me read. He says, they, talking about the Christians, they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses or responsive verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. So here we have Pliny, just in the early part of the second century. He's recognizing the presence of Christians. In fact, in the context of this letter, he's telling Trajan that he's been persecuting Christians, he's been rooting them out, he's been compelling them to deny their faith, and he's even executed Christians. So we're seeing early persecution of Christians in this context, but he leaves us this record that, yes, these people worship Christ as a God. They worship him as a God. So we've got attestation of this individual named Christ, but also the fact that he was already recognized as a divine figure, something the Bible teaches so clearly, something Christians have always believed, and yet some modern scholars try to say that that was an accretion that came later and all this kind of thing. Very interesting. Pliny the Younger. Not to be confused with his uncle Pliny the Elder, in case you're wondering why they called him Pliny the Younger. What about Josephus? Josephus was a Jewish historian and very well known. Most people have heard at least of Josephus. And Josephus writes in his work called The Antiquities of the Jews. He wrote that around 93 AD. So again, right within the first century. Josephus, by the way, lived from about 37 to 101 AD. Very early attestation. He was born just 4 years after the crucifixion. Um, Now, I will say, to frame this, because you'll hear some detractors mention this, there are versions of this uh, writing, the Antiquities of the Jews, of this particular section, Book 18, verses 63 through 64, that I'm going to read. There are certain versions that are pretty overtly edited by, a well-intended Christian of later centuries. That's pretty much accepted by scholars that that's what happened, so I'm not gonna deny that some of the versions are a little bit more direct and more explicit of their approval of Jesus as the Christ of the Jews, but I'm reading um, a proposed translation that is, written by John Meyer, or translated by John Meyer, that excises those more, clear interpolations, and really, in Dr. Meyer's estimation, would give us the pretty close to the original text of what Josephus wrote. But it's very interesting. It's what I would call a neutral reconstruction. So this is from Josephus' Antiquities, Book 18, 63 through 64. Listen to what he says. Now, around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who gladly accept the truth. He won over both many Jews and many Greeks. Pilate, when he heard him accused by the leading men among us, that's among the Jews, condemned him to the cross. But those who had first loved him did not cease doing so. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared. So we see a few things there. We see that he recognizes Jesus as a real person, as a wise man, as a teacher. He even mentions amazing deeds. He mentions Pilate, that lines right up with the biblical account that Pilate was the governor at that time, the accusations of the Jews. He mentions the condemnation to death on the cross, and that Christians continue to follow him. It's pretty amazing when you think about what is here, what is said. So we've got so many witnesses, the biblical, the extra biblical Christian, the extra biblical non-Christian. What about the witness of the early martyrs? Well, we've got martyrs like the original apostles themselves. Judas betrayed Jesus, but of those 11 that remained faithful, tradition tells us that 10 of them died as martyrs. The one that didn't die as a martyr, John, the beloved, they tried to kill him and didn't. But the point is, these were men that followed Jesus, knew him, documented his life, documented the faith that he taught, and were willing to die in order to retain that. They were willing to die to pay these terrible prices, suffer terrible tortures, but they weren't willing to say, "Oh, well, we just made it all up and it doesn't even make sense. What, they just took a literary figure, a literary foil and created the ideal person? Well, if they were even gonna think in that way, it seems like they would have gone a lot further back than their own contemporary lifetime. Why would they have made that claim when there were so many people around that could say, "Who are you talking about? We don't even know anything about this." It doesn't even make sense. If they were gonna fabricate the thing, that they would have done it and just made up Jesus. So, obviously, they knew and believed in Jesus. They believed in his message. Right at the turn of the first, going into the 2nd century, we have Ignatius that was a martyr. His letters we still have. Very, very early witness there. We've got Polycarp right on the heels of his time. We've got Perpetua and Felicitas. I mean, you look at just so many martyrs and the testimony that they had very early on, and you have to ask yourself, what did they have to gain by holding up this supposedly false narrative? Nothing. They lost everything to, if they knew it was a lie, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they would have been willing to die, to suffer and die, to face all the challenges that they did right up until the end, if it was just a lie, just a fabrication. So it doesn't even make sense from a rational perspective. So was Jesus a real person? Well, obviously my contention is yes. Yes, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ was a real flesh and blood human being that walked the planet 2,000 years ago, and unquestionable. That's incontrovertible fact. And it has been said, I think it's true, that there's more attestation for the life of Jesus Christ than any other figure of the ancient world, any other figure of antiquity. There's more evidence for him than any of them. We've got the whole New Testament corpus. We've got these other writings I've mentioned. Even antagonists are mentioning him. And this is not just some, viewpoint that a few Christian zealots hold to because, we've got to have our faith crutch. If you take scholars of the Greco-Roman world, antiquity, ancient Israel, Christian scholars, just a wide range of fields, a wide range of expertise. And you're going to find that scholars of all shades, all stripes, pretty much across the board are unanimous that Jesus Christ of Nazareth actually existed. It's only a very rare fringe group that tries to say that he didn't live, that he wasn't a real historical figure. Now, that doesn't mean that all those people accept his claims of divinity or that they accept that what we have in the New Testament canon is actually reflective of what Jesus of Nazareth taught. That's a separate question. But as far as this foundational question that we're dealing with today, it is virtually unanimous. The scholarly consensus is unanimous that Jesus Christ actually existed. He is a real person. Now, what's so fascinating about Jesus is that 2,000 years later, his life and his teachings still stand at the center of so much theological, philosophical, ethical dialogue. He is a watershed personality for the ages. That is unquestionable. No person has had such a far-reaching and such a sustained impact on human history as Jesus of Nazareth. The question, it would be, why is that the case? And I think that's a question that's worthy of your consideration.